Welcome to Stories and Sips. My name is Barry Chandler. In this episode, we are going to have a great conversation with another Irish whiskey innovator. So we recently had a great chat with Nick Ryan from Thomond Gate Whiskey, somebody doing something interesting, something new, something quite risky in the Irish whiskey world. Got a great reaction to that episode, and I got asked to do more interviews with those smaller companies, those independent operators and risk takers who are doing interesting and perhaps crazy things in the Irish whiskey world. So I'm delighted in this episode to have another one of those interviews. So we're going to sit down today with Patrick Shelley, the founder of Origin Spirits, who's doing really interesting things. He is about to launch an Irish first, if not a world first, in the Irish whiskey world with his unique innovation. It's a fantastic story, what sounds like a fantastic product. So I'm looking forward to sharing it with you. So let's have a chat with Patrick. Patrick Shelley, thank you for joining us on Stories and Sips. I know you're a very busy man. You're in the middle of a big launch at the moment, but thank you for taking the time out of it. Tell us, what is it that you're in the middle of launching at the moment?
Delighted to be here, Barry. Thank you very much for the invitation. We're actually launching a single malt Irish whiskey, which is finished in seaweed charred casks.
Seaweed charred casks. This is the first I've ever heard of it. Is it the first time it's ever been done, or has this been attempted in the past?
From our records, we haven't come across it anywhere else in the world. So it is, we hope, a true innovation.
So this is a single malt it's not that seaweed has been blended with the whiskey for fear that anybody might be worried about that. It's something different. It's to do with the finishing. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Give us a little bit more detail.
Well, what we do, we distill our whiskey in the classic way. It's a 3 times distilled single malt. We then procure American virgin oak casks. And then what we do is we char the interior of the casks with seaweed. So effectively we burn seaweed inside the cask. The objective is more to give that smoke treatment to the wood from the seaweed rather than actually burning the wood. And then what we do is after the charring, we add the single malt whiskey and leave it to finish for 3 months.
What impact have you found the seaweed has had that charring a cask in any other way would have?
I think first of all, it's the raw material. It's such a fascinating ingredient because the seaweed, when it's raw, it's very salty, it's quite fishy, etc. When it's dried, it takes on another character. And what's interesting to us is when it's actually cooked or roasted, it takes on completely different flavors. So we're actually, for our first whiskey, we're actually using Atlantic kombu kelp. And when the kelp is charred, it gives off these lovely nutty dark chocolate, almost like salted caramel flavors. And we feel this is a perfect kind of addition to bring another element of the Irish terroir to the whiskey.
So you're not getting the briny, salty, traditional view of what seaweed might be. If I went down to the Strand and picked up a bit and threw it in my mouth, it's a different flavor profile when you roast it.
Yes, it's very different, but you still get that, what we call this umami character. So there's a light salinity, particularly at the end of the palate. But what we find is that the flavors, it just creates this multi-layer within the whiskey. So you've got the classic, whiskey flavors or the flavors from the single malt, but it's just adding layer upon layer, what we like to say of complexity to it. And we think it works really, really well. It's quite an unusual take on Irish whiskey, I'd say, because it is adding this element. What I like to say is that it's almost a fusion of the land and the sea. The land is obviously where we grow our malted barley, particularly in the southeast of Ireland. And then that seaweed just adds this extra character, I suppose, to the finished product.
So you're not a stranger to the drinks world, lest the audience be worried that some madman one day over a pint came up with an idea to throw a bit of seaweed in a barrel and light it on fire and add some whiskey. You've had a long, storied career that's very relevant to what you're doing today. So help the audience understand your background, Patrick, and how you eventually came to this, because I know we've got some other products as well that we want to talk about, but I'm very curious about what led you to this and what's your background.
Well, first of all, I've been called a madman and crazy a lot of times. I like to take it as a compliment, because I think when somebody says that, you're obviously doing something that's shaking things up a little. I think my background, I spent 20 years in the drinks industry, 15 of which I spent with probably the largest luxury goods company in the world, LVMH, so Louis Vuitton, Moet Hennessy. I started initially looking after Central Eastern Europe for Hennessy Cognac, so building distribution, managing distributors, but also building the brands. I then moved to Asia, looking after the Moët Chandon Champagne and Dom Perignon. From there, I moved back to manage the international business on one of the niche champagne brands in the group called Ruinart. And then finally, my last position was where I was sent to Russia to help open a subsidiary for Moet Hennessy. During that time, I spent a little bit of work. I did a little bit of work on mergers, acquisitions as well. So I suppose my background is kind of a mixture of sales, marketing, general management, a bit of mergers, acquisitions. The funny thing, I ran businesses within the group of LVMH. I could never have been prepared for the shock of doing it myself. I think this is one of the things in a lot of big corporations, you have a lot of people to do the other stuff for you. You know, I didn't know how to order a truck, you know, I didn't know how to do a design brief. We had marketing people doing that, you know. I didn't even know how to do a balance sheet, you know.
So how did you make that leap from one of the largest luxury goods companies in the world? What made you leave let's say the relative comfort of that large infrastructure to decide, you know what I'm going to do now? I'm going to do all of this, but on my own.
I don't think there was ever a conscious decision. I think what happened was, you know, I felt that I probably went as far as I could within the group without plateauing. And then I decided, you know, maybe it's a time now to try something myself. The one thing about, I suppose, working with Moet Hennessy is they have some of the most incredible brands in the world in the wine and spirits industry. And I thought that from what I'd learned, you know, during that period, I could apply it to do something myself. I would say, however, I wasn't at all prepared once I actually decided to make the leap. It's a great leveler, actually, when you leave the comfort of, you know, a nice paycheck coming in every month to actually nothing coming in, you know. But I suppose it was this passion I had, Barry, you know, the fact that I'd worked all over the world. I'd never actually worked in Ireland up to that stage. I'd been in school there, I'd studied there, but I'd never worked. I suppose it was this kind of call to come back and do something and maybe bring the little experience I had to turning my hand at doing something interesting. The first product, actually, at that time, that was 7 years ago, 7 years ago, everybody else was talking whiskey in Ireland at the time. And I said, you know, maybe look at something, you know, even though whiskey would be my go-to spirit and always has been. There was the one thing I was fascinated by, though, was that when I went out with friends or family, I'd be drinking whiskey or wine and they'd be drinking vodka. And I couldn't understand why people would drink vodka, because everything I love about wine and whiskey is that depth, that complexity, that character, that personality. that you find, which I felt was non-existent in vodka.
That time in Russia didn't convince and convert you to the white spirit at all, no?
No, it didn't. It didn't. I actually probably drank more whiskey in Russia than anybody else. And it started off, to be perfectly honest, like almost like a personal challenge, saying, maybe if I could create a vodka that I could drink, then maybe other people would like it too. And I suppose I was very kind of focused on the whiskey element. So this is what we do so well in Ireland. So I thought, why not actually make a vodka from malted barley? And why not actually distill a vodka on copper pot stills? So again, a slightly different take to what vodka was and how vodka is perceived to be. But again, I didn't really know what I was getting into. This had never been done before, certainly as we were doing it. We had to bring in a lot of expertise. We worked, for example, with this guy called Dr. Jim Swan. You might have come across him.
Right.
And some other kind of world-class kind of, people in the industry. But above all, I think it was I met the guys from West Cork Distilleries early on in the journey, and I think part of them were kind of saying, this guy is mad,
That's big coming from those guys.
But I think they were intrigued by the idea of actually doing something that hadn't been done before, and actually producing a really high quality product, because my background is premium. I'm not interested in doing entry level, or I really wanted to create something that was unique.
So is this kind of informed by, you mentioned wanting to have a vodka you could drink, but clearly there's this Eastern European, Russian influence in the back of your mind? Are you thinking, I'll show these Russians what a real vodka should taste like with the right ingredients? Or was that at all in your mind, that we'll bring this back and show them what it should be like?
It's funny you asked that, because I said to myself, the last place I'll probably sell my vodka is Russia. And funnily enough, it's now our second biggest market in Europe. So I've just come back from Moscow last week, and it's doing very well there. But I think that's, Barry, to do more with the change in consumers and how they view products and how they evaluate products. When I was living in Russia, it was all about quantity and as much as you could drink. Now it's a lot more about savoring, good quality spirits that are possibly more expensive, and drinking them a lot more responsibly. And I think that's where Currach, which is a Currach single malt vodka, fits in, because it responds to a market need there, where people actually genuinely appreciate, how that base ingredient and distillation can actually have a positive impact on the spirit.
So single malt vodka, like all with Irish ingredients, completely Irish?
They're completely Irish. They're all from I'd say 90% probably from the southeast, so the Waterford, Wexford, East Cork area. Little pockets in Kilkenny, I think Kildare. But it's then, we source it from West Cork Distillers, but prior to that, the actual malting barley is malted in the Malting Company of Ireland in Cork. Then in West Cork Distillers, it's milled, mashed, fermented, and 4 times copper pot distilled.
Wow.
We need to distill 4 times to hit the required legal definition of a vodka, which is a spirit that's 96% pure.
Okay. So this foray into vodka required you then to open up and figure out distribution channels, marketing, packaging, everything.
Yes.
And you decided, that's not hard enough, let's launch a second product.
I think quite early in the journey with Currach, Barry, and particularly in the US, it started getting kind of the reputation as the whiskey drinkers vodka, which I was thrilled with, because that's exactly how I wanted it to be seen. And a lot of people were saying, "Oh, are you going to do another flavored vodka?" And to be honest, as you know very well, we're not good at maybe growing oranges and lemons in Ireland to make actually a flavored vodka. So I was looking at, what else could we use from that Irish terroir to create something interesting. And again, I took, I suppose, inspiration from the whole whiskey world in that of peat. So our second product was what we call a Currach peat cask single malt vodka. Similar approach to our whiskey now. We're using virgin American oak casks and charred the interior with peat from the Glengarriff bog. In that case, we needed to leave it 4 months to finish. And that it's really, whereas Currach single malt vodkas, it's currently one of only 2 or 3 single malt vodkas in the world. The peat cask is very unique. There's nobody doing anything like that.
So that wouldn't really, when I think about a peated or I think about a flavored vodka, the last thing I'm thinking about is a bit of turf from the bogs of Glengarriff.
Well, one of my favorite peated whiskies, or like say the whiskey house, is Ardbeg. And I suppose even though it was kind of a reference for me, I felt that, sometimes peated, strongly peated whiskies can be quite divisive from consumer perspective. And that wasn't at all the objective here, to create a heavily peated vodka. We just wanted to bring in that element of peat, just enough that you can taste it, but more importantly, that you can pick up the beautiful creamy, buttery, pastry, chocolatey notes of the single malt spirit,
And are you finding that vodka drinkers are enjoying the peated vodka, or is it non-traditional vodka drinkers?
I think our consumer is probably, we have, generally it's premium vodka drinkers, but which is more interesting for me is that we have a lot of whiskey drinkers who would never drink vodka that are drinking our products, A lot of bartenders around the world are using Currach to create, recreate whiskey cocktails. So things like old fashions, etc. They've been quite innovative in what they're doing with it.
So these 2 single malt products in the vodka category started to take hold for you. You started to get on shelves in quite prestigious establishments, from what I understand, around the world. But there was one more leap. There was one more product in between the vodka and the whiskey, if I understand, right?
Yes. Friends still joke to this day. They say, Patrick, I remember you saying 3 years ago, over my dead body will I do a gin, And then what did we do? We did a gin. I suppose the reason, Barry, I was so reluctant to do a gin, because even today you can see the market is heavily flooded with gins, not just in Ireland, but in every other country. And I felt that unless we could do something very unique, there was really no point in starting this. Where a lot of gins kind of take their point of differentiation is on the botanicals. We took a slightly different approach, and we said that, okay, if you actually analyze what a gin is, basically in a bottle of gin, you have maybe between 90 and 95% base spirit. So the botanicals represent, between 5 and 10% of the finished product. Not a lot of people actually talk about that base spirit. Everybody's talking about the botanicals. And we said, well, why don't we actually use a really kick-ass base spirit made from malted barley?
All right. So start the bit about nobody talks about a base spirit again, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah. Within the gin market, when people are making gin, you probably have noticed that there's a huge emphasis on botanicals, because effectively that's what makes a gin and gives it its character. What people don't tend to realize is that what's actually in a bottle of gin is 95%, between 90 and 95% base spirit. Generally, this base spirit is a neutral grain spirit, distilled on column stills, doing what it says on the box. It's a spirit high in alcohol, but there's not really anything else. So the botanicals tend to give almost this kind of a lateral taste profile, one after the other. What you miss on a gin I think on using a neutral grain spirit is that depth that you would find in a whiskey. So we said, why don't we actually turn the whole thing on its head and focus primarily on the base spirit, using a single malt base spirit. Effectively, what we're doing is we're using our vodka Currach as the base spirit.
I see.
But what's interesting here, Barry, is that rather than me saying, "Oh, I like ginger," or "I like lemon peel, orange peel," we actually almost interviewed each botanical on the basis of how they actually get on with the base. And that was really fascinating, because things we thought would work didn't work at all. And when you had a number of botanicals together with the base, sometimes it was creating an eruption.
So you deconstructed it and put it back together in the way that you felt made for a more complex, kind of a richer flavor profile.
And so we're actually only using 5 botanicals in the gin. The gin, by the way, is called Ornabrac, which means from the Irish word ornabraca, meaning malted barley. So again, really celebrating the base. So we're only using juniper, angelica root, which are 2 classic kind of stays within a gin. Then we're using pine needles from the forest in Cork. We're using lemon verbena and a little touch of lemon peel.
There's a great influence from Cork in all of these products, I'm noticing, very proudly as we talk. Obviously, Cork products are the greatest products in the world, and that's why you've chosen them, right?
Absolutely. I'm not a Cork native, but I studied in UCC, so I'm a kind of an adopted Corkonian.
We'd almost adopt you at this stage now with all you're doing for Cork. So these products were naturally leading towards whiskey. There's no doubt about it. You started when everyone was looking at whiskey. You said, "No, I'm going a different path. There's other opportunities to use the same ingredients but do different things." Yes. And now you're back to whiskey again. So you've got this single malt whiskey, and you speak very openly and proudly about your collaboration with the distillers. So West Cork Distillers are your distilling partner, yes. And I'm loving how open you are about that collaboration. It seems like there's great pride in the sum of these 2 parts being greater than each of them individually.
Yes, I mean, I think there's no way we could have achieved what we've achieved without the guys in West Cork. They've been an absolute pleasure to work with. It's great fun working with them too. There's a level of innovation and nothing stopping you. No is never kind of an answer. And I think it really suited where we were coming from, because we were looking for that very much in a partner, So what I would say just before we get on to the whiskey, Barry, is that the one thing I think the point of common between everything we've done up to the whiskey, you've almost had this kind of a DNA running through each of the products, which is number 1, Irish malted barley, and number 2, pot distilled. That's really the ethos of what we're doing. I always like to say we're not selling Irish products. We're selling world-class products that happen to be Irish. And I think that's an important distinction, because I think a product needs to stand on its own 2 feet, irrespective of origin. Obviously, in our case, Ireland is a cherry on the cake, because people know how good Ireland is at distilling and brewing. So it certainly helps our case. But I just like to emphasize that it's really the products themselves.
That's a great point. I'm particularly interested and encouraged by your story of going abroad, going overseas, seeing what literally world class meant. Even though we had it on our doorstep, like Irish products have been great forever, but now you're going somewhere else and seeing what they consider to be world class, and then maybe seeing where there's an opportunity to showcase more of what we're doing in Ireland. And I love this idea of going abroad, expanding the horizons. The ceiling just gets higher and higher and higher as you realize, okay, there's a lot more we could do. And you're coming back to Ireland and you're saying to the lads in West Cork, here's one for you. And you're coming rolling in with a car full of seaweed and say, we're going to do something very different here. And I think it's going to stand up on a world stage. I love the guts of that, but you've already seen what works at the luxury end. So it's not, it seems like a bit of a calculated risk rather than a roll of the dice.
It is, and the one thing I just add is that nothing leaves the distillery unless we're 100% happy with it. So, you know, our whiskey has been a long time in the planning, as was the gin and others before it. So, yes, yes, there is a risk element, but we kind of know once the product leaves that it will certainly be liked by a certain number of people. We can't say everybody. And I think that's important as well, because I'm always more in favor of having 20% passionate endorsers of your brand.
I agree with you. Yeah.
Than 80% that see it as kind of vanilla-like, you know?
Well, we have great brands in Ireland, whiskey brands that have gone out and have carved a path in a larger market for those that want to come in from a more artisanal standpoint and do different things, which is great. So I think we're all the whiskey brands that come out today are standing on the shoulders of giants, but doing incredible things, I think, based on the response that they've seen from these more mass market whiskey brands. I'd like to just spend a few minutes talking about the whiskey itself then. So we haven't yet mentioned the name. It's Currach, Currach single malt Irish whiskey. And tell me a little bit about its ABV, what style it is, maybe how old it is, if you can share. Tell me a little bit about that side of the whiskey.
Okay, so first of all, it's 46% proof, non-chill filtered, and obviously it's a triple distilled, non-age statement. The whiskey is actually between 3 to 4 years old. The style, I don't know how you would describe the style. I've had this question a lot of times on our vodka, and I think once you have something that's quite unique compared to what's out there, it's sometimes difficult to put a label on it. I like to, I suppose, describe it as a whiskey that is bizarrely democratic, because I think that the depth and complexity and that multi-layer you get can be appealing to people who are whiskey aficionados. But the reason I use the word democratic is that I feel that it could also potentially bring other drinkers into the whiskey category, excuse me, through its subtlety, through that light sweetness. And the sweetness, you know, works wonderfully with that umami element. So again, I really don't know how to put a label on it. I think we might need to do some more work as to how to describe the style. And I'm not being smart here. I genuinely don't know how to describe it. You know?
It fits the technical bill of being a single malt, obviously. It's got all of the legal requirements to be a single malt, but the flavor profile, I think, is going to, sounds like, and I haven't tried it yet, I'm looking forward to trying it. Sounds like it's going to be a very different style of single malt than maybe single malt drinkers are used to, which is a good thing. And I know there'll be, I'm sure, those with raised eyebrows at the thought of a seaweed charred cask, but I'm struggling to think about how that's any different than any other innovations in wood that we've used historically. I mean, we've got whiskies that age in chestnut and French limousine and we're using wine and port and sherry barrels. Those were all innovations, I suppose, in their time. I don't see how this is any different or that dramatic a shift, really.
Yes, and again, one of the kind of the leading principles on this, Barry, was to, I suppose, to follow this kind of avant-garde approach we've had on the other products, to do something a little bit different, but keeping it very authentic at the same time. And I suppose you know, personally, I was too fixed on the Irish terroir, you know, the malted barley, the peat initially for the peated vodka. Sometimes once you're too focused on something, you don't see the other elements around you. And I think, as you know, Ireland as an island nation is really defined, the country is defined by the sea around it, by the maritime culture. Whether it's you know, fish or seaweed, and I just felt that, you know, seaweed as an ingredient would be a very interesting addition to at least experiment with. And again, we had no clue when we started that this would work.
Were there some failures along the way, as there should be with every great innovation, to get to what you have in the bottle today?
Bizarrely, I think we were more pleasantly surprised that there wasn't on the other products we had. I think I remember when Stephen and I were down tasting the first test cask we did. We tried a number of different techniques of charring. We tried a number of different varieties of seaweed. So we had a number of kind of test casks going over a couple of months. And I remember we went down after the first month and we tasted it and said, interesting. Came back the second month and we were going, wow, this is something that has surpassed our expectations even on 2 months in cask. And then the third month, it was just a confirmation of what we had thought, you know.
And it's a virgin American oak cask. Is that what
Yes.
if I recall you had shared? Okay. So really the only flavor you're imparting into that whiskey is coming from the seaweed then. There's been no liquid in that before.
No. They're virgin American. We get them from the Kelvin cooperage in Kentucky.
Okay. I love this. I love the story behind it. I had a comment on one of my episodes yesterday from a gentleman in the United States that said that typically when he watches a video about whiskey, he's listening to the technical aspects of it, and he said that's fine, but he said he's more interested in the story because he wants to know the people behind it and he wants to know other details, and he said it makes the whiskey to him taste better. So there's a story here, and we can argue about the truth of that or not, but you come from a big brand background and you understand the value of story and connecting kind of emotionally. This is an Irish story, isn't it? It's a story of the sea, of the place, of the ingredients. We've, like you say, an island nation that has maybe punched above its weight for many, many years, since the time of the monks getting into those small little boats and going off, and maybe one of them even discovered America. That's open for debate, but we think that he did. And then coming back to Ireland with what they've learned. You're a bit of a monk yourself, having got into a boat and gone off to Eastern Europe and come back with your innovations and your ideas. There's a great story of Ireland though here, isn't there, of innovation and history together?
I think it is, and you mentioned an interesting point there. I think the whole story of the Currach, if you break it down, it was really all about exporting knowledge and importing innovation. I think that as a symbol is very potent, and I think is very characteristic of what Ireland has become today.
For those who don't know what a Currach is, for those of our US friends, tell me what's a Currach?
A Currach is a traditional Irish boat. It was made originally from wicker, animal hides and tar. It actually dates back to the Neolithic times, but it really only came into its own in the 4th century. I think the trade between Ireland, Scotland, the Isle of Wight, etc., there was such an abundance of Currachs on the sea that that period actually became known as the Currach Age. Then I think from the 5th, 6th century, just after the fall of the Roman Empire, it was a really interesting time because this is where Ireland became, took over almost the custodian of literature, of culture, of learning. People used to travel from all over Europe to Ireland to study in the monasteries. And this was so successful. I suppose the monks were like innovators and entrepreneurs of their time. They said, well, look, guys, this is that we're onto a good thing here. Maybe we should export this knowledge. So they traveled to the far breadths of Europe in the Currach, and they brought back some very interesting innovation with them and ideas that has helped Ireland become who it is today. One of those innovations, which is partly why we're all here today, is the alembic. So the Irish monks allegedly discovered the alembic in Greece, I think in the 5th or 6th century. The Greeks had been using the alembic to distill perfumes or essential oils. They had actually inherited it previously from the Egyptians.
And the alembic is the forerunner to the still we know today, right?
Exactly. So the alembic, which became later the pot still. So it was the Irish monks who started experimenting with kind of fruits and, distilling kind of low alcohol spirits. That I suppose we could say has been the forerunner of distillation as we know it today. Interestingly, somebody said to me in Russia last week, Patrick, with all due respect, it's a really nice vodka you're producing, but the Russians, we actually created vodka. And I said, I'll give that to you. The Poles might have one or two things to say, but let's not argue over it. But I said, I will say one thing, had it not been for the Irish, you wouldn't even be distilling.
So tell us what's next with this. So you've got this Currach single malt, it's about to hit the market. Is the plan to export this globally? Is the plan to build sales of this in Ireland? What's the plan for the product?
We're starting off step by step. So our first batch is going to be bottled. It's going to be released probably on the 16th or 17th of just after St. Patrick's Day in Ireland and internationally. It's all pretty much sold already prior to actually being produced. We are focusing on Europe, Asia, and the US. We will then, with subsequent batches, we'll roll out to other Asian, secondary Asian markets, European markets, and some of the other internationals. One thing I see in particular is that we're getting extremely very high interest from the Asian markets, and that's probably not surprising, as single malt as a category is so well entwined in their culture, but also they have a culture of eating and consuming seaweed.
Right. And that's something that the Irish haven't. Well, the Irish ignored the seaweed for generations. It was, and going back to famine times, it was considered the last resort. People eating seaweed, it was the food of the poor. But you can't go into a high-end restaurant in Ireland now without seeing seaweed somewhere on the menu. There's a resurgence in demand, and the Asians are well ahead of us. They never stopped using seaweed as a part of their diet, did they?
No. I mean, I think the first seaweed, with some research we were doing initially, I think seaweed starts cropping up in China in 2700 BC as a stable food source. But even the story of St. Columkill and Iona, they were feeding seaweed to the monks, to the poor of that area, and that was back in what was it, 4th, 5th century again. So it is very much part of the Irish culture. there was, I think, an expression saying something like that dillisk on a rock is the same value as a cow. So it just showed to the Irish at the time how valuable it was as a natural ingredient.
And we ignored it. I
Yeah,
wonder how it fell off how it fell out of favor. I wonder, was it because we got better at farming the land? Was it because we had more of a dependence on that, or we didn't have, even though we're a small island nation, it would have been hard for those inland to make it to the sea? I wonder.
yeah, it's a good question. I don't know. But I think seaweed. What we're being very careful in the sourcing of our seaweed. We're actually working with this great company in Clare called Wild Irish Seaweeds, the Talty family who own it. They've been harvesting seaweed for generations. And what's important to us, Barry, is that it's sustainable, it's organic, it's hand harvested. And that's really, really important, I suppose, to our ethos as a company, but also that's important to consumers, knowing that they're consuming something of high quality and sustainable.
That's great. And I think that ties in so much with the Irish product that we're seeing develop now, of this traceability, this sourcing, this verification of source is so important. And I think beyond this, just the transparency of it, the storytelling opportunities that come with having more participants part of that story is incredible. The fact that you can tell the story of Wild Irish Seaweed, you can tell the story of West Cork Distillers, and we can tell the story of Origin Spirits, and together you've collaborated to bring this product to the market that no one of you individually could have done. And boy, what a story that is to tell overseas. You couldn't make it up, really, could you?
No, you couldn't. But I think that's one thing I'm personally really happy about, because every success, I think, is broken down to different moving parts, and in our case, we like to celebrate the moving parts that have actually helped create the final product. And it's not really, it's not really from a storytelling perspective. It's more, again, we believe we need to be transparent with people, with our consumers and our trade partners. And I think once you're working with such professionals as we are, with West Cork Distillers and Wild Atlantic Seaweeds, Wild Irish Seaweeds, it's also a pleasure to highlight that.
Absolutely, it is. Yeah, I'm just from the first moment I heard about this, and I hear about new whiskies on a weekly basis. Many of them are no doubt great whiskies, but they can't hold an audience when we start talking about them beyond the technical side. And I'm always looking for this extra angle. And I know that at the base, the whiskey has to be phenomenal. But beyond that, if all whiskies are phenomenal, and I'm going to argue that all whiskies coming out of Ireland are phenomenal, but beyond that, what's going to differentiate them? And how are you going to stand out? And how are you going to help people get introduced, not just to their product, but ultimately to Ireland? Because isn't that what we're trying to do? We're trying to showcase the country, and not just through its products. And so to me, I love this idea of, you've had a long career in big brands, luxury brands, and you're applying your skills to this product and this company, and you're taking it back out with you, the Irish product back out with you around the world, to show others what we can do. I'd love to see more of that coming out of the industry, and I'm hoping that what you're doing is going to encourage more to showcase not just the products, but the collaboration of community, of coming together. Whiskey brings people together. It looks like you've done a good job of bringing the right people together for this one.
Yes, and I think also, I have a really good relationship with a lot of the other spirits producers, particularly whiskey producers in Ireland, and I think we all share that same vision. That yes, it is about our individual brands, but more importantly, and taking a panoramic view, it's also more important about how the category is perceived abroad. So I think I feel almost I have an obligation, to once we have Ireland or Irish on the label, that we're introducing consumers around the world to something of very high quality, and something that's quite unique. And I think everybody benefit. The other brands that are doing that, we benefit from, as we would hope others may in the future benefit from what we're doing. So it is that it's another type of collaboration again there, Barry, but which I think is equally as important.
So if this is received as well as we hope it will be received, will there be, are there plans to perhaps use additional types of seaweed, try other varietals and create a seaweed series?
As I said, we've done, I think we have tested 4 or 5 different seaweeds already in test casks. 2 of them are looking particularly promising. So I think it's a fair assumption that we will release 2 different seaweed expressions in the future, possibly more, you know.
Well, as you fill your proverbial Currach with single malt and send it around the world, would you ever send a Currach of it over to me here so that I can try this whiskey? That is, I'm just fascinated by the innovation and the approach and the story behind it.
You'll have one of the first bottles off the line, Barry, I promise you.
Very good, very good. Well, Patrick, thank you again for taking time out of your busy launch. I know we're recording this before the product goes live, and and as it hits the shelves, people will be able to learn more about it through this episode. But thank you for taking the time out of your busy day. I'm really excited to see the reaction to this. Innovation, collaboration, story, educating people around the world about Ireland has my unwavering support at all times. I'm delighted to get to showcase you hopefully to a wider audience who will have questions and interest and can fill up their shopping trolleys with and their own Currachs with this single malt hopefully going forward. So again, the best of luck with the launch. Thank you for joining us, and I hope it goes really well for you.
An absolute pleasure. Thank you very much, Barry, for having me.
Thanks, Patrick.